Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. In this episode, we're going to finish the diorama we started making in the last episode. It's our submission for the Great YouTube Paint-Off, a painting contest hosted by Lack of Foresight Gaming. In the last couple weeks, the videos I've covered included, first, the painting of a T-34 tank, and then the construction of a wooden farmhouse. These are some of the key components for the diorama that I'm building for the Great YouTube Paint-Off. This is a painting competition hosted by the channel known as Lack of Foresight Gaming. It's a great YouTube channel, and I suggest you check it out. Lack of Foresight Gaming is getting together many of YouTube's historical model painters that usually work in 28mm or 1:100 scale. The objective is to pull out all the stops and just create a piece of work that is as impressive as we can make it. The only other restriction on that is that you either need a few vehicles, a couple stands of infantry, and that the whole scene has to be set in the autumn. I was really excited to tackle this, and I think the results that I've done so far are pretty good. Now it's time to put the finishing touches on and get down to work on the base. In my previous episode where I built the wooden farmhouse, I already laid out the rough shape of the base. I cut it out of styrofoam. Refer to my earlier video if you want to see how this worked out. When this was done, I got out a chisel-shaped knife and I cut a channel into the base to create a ditch. Where that had gone in, I got out some plastic cable protector, the kind that looks like corrugated metal, cut out a little chunk, and glued it into place. I knew I wanted to have a road on this base, and so I had previously printed some tiles on my 3D printer to look like brick roads. I found the file on Thingiverse. I glued these down with Mod Podge, and then put some heavy books on top to hold them down flat. After this was done, I left the whole thing to sit overnight. It wouldn't make a lot of sense for all the ground on the model to be completely level, so I got out some 5mm thick foam core and cut out some extra pieces. I cut them with ragged shapes and fastened them down to the top of the foam. This would create a bit of an effect where there was some undulating earth. Of course, anywhere that was supposed to be completely level, where fences or a building were supposed to go, I left flat. I then got out my file and rounded off the edges of the foam core and filed some grooves and other shapes into it to make the ground suitably rough. I felt I really needed to add lots of interesting texture to the model, so I decided to put a stone patio in around the farmhouse. I got out a pen and scored the shapes of the rocks straight into the surface of the pink styrofoam itself. When this was finished, I then got out my hot glue gun and glued down the farmhouse, some trees, and some brick fences. I was lucky because I had the fences and the trees left over from another project I was working on. This brought me to the point where I could start adding some grit and texture. As always, I decided to use the rubbing alcohol method. I started by pouring out some matte Mod Podge into a cup and added some black paint to it. The black paint will just help form a dark base layer to make undercoating easier later. Then, taking a ratty old brush, I spread this down over the diorama in any place where I expected there to be dirt or grit, which was pretty well everywhere that wasn't the patio or the road. Then when this was done, I got out my trusty mix of about 80% sand to about 20% kitty litter and sprinkled this all over the Mod Podge. While the glue was still wet, I went on to the next technique. I poured out some rubbing alcohol, mixed it up with a little bit of extra black paint, and picked this up with a pipette. I deposited the rubbing alcohol over the grit with the pipette, and then using the same pipette, went back to my original mix of Mod Podge and black paint. I watered this down a little more and picked it up with the pipette and deposited it over top of the rubbing alcohol. The rubbing alcohol will break the surface tension of the glue and help it permeate all the way down through the grit. In the end, when this dries, you get a rock-solid bond. I figured now would be a good time to finish priming the diorama, so I took out the black Mod Podge that was left and with a large brush spread it over top of the road, the patio, and around the edges on the foam itself. This would just form a good substrate onto which I could put my acrylic paints later. With all this done, I left the model to dry for about 24 hours. Now it was time to get to work with my airbrush, but to prepare first, I decided I better mask off around the farmhouse and the brick walls. I didn't want any of the work I had already painted to get overspray on it. Getting out my airbrush, I load it with some light gray paint and then go ahead and just spray it over the road. When that's finished, I got out all sorts of different acrylic paints that had different earth tones. This included Vallejo Old Wood, different shades of brown, and a couple different shades of gray. I alternated dry brushing these in different colors with different intensities over the road itself. Moving back to the grit, I got out some shades of brown and tan and dry brushed them on. I went from the darkest colors to the lightest colors. Finally, I got out some pure white and I lightly dry brushed that over all of the dirt, the rocks, and even a little bit on the road. This completed the messy dry brushing, so now I went ahead and removed the masking tape. I decided now would be a good time to up the visual interest of different features of the diorama by adding some weathering. I got out my weathering pencils and went and applied a bunch of different colors on the patio stones, some of the rocks, and used it to alter the colors of the odd brick on the road. Then using a moist brush, I went in and blended this out. At this time I also used my weathering pencils to work some shades of green and some earth tones into the bed of the ditch. This would give it a suitably muddy and possibly algae encrusted appearance. By now you've seen that I really consider my weathering pencils one of the stars of the show. If you have not used these items before, check them out. AK Interactive's weathering pencils are just simply incredible to work with. I decided I needed to rebuild the definition on the bricks and some of the finer details, so I got out my trusty black acrylic ink and went back with a fine brush and lined everything in. And yes, this process does take a very long time, but it really does help the final result and makes the little details stand out. To finalize the painting steps on the project, I now took out some rust tone enamels and worked them into the culvert. And with that, it was now time to move on to the landscaping. I started by using some Mod Podge to glue some weeds that I had made from twine into place. I make these myself, and I've covered how this is done in an earlier video. I'll put the link up. When I had installed a bunch of these and I was satisfied, I then went in and used a variety of different types of store-bought grass clumps. I always have a large variety of different sizes, types, and colors on hand to try to increase the visual interest. When I made various gardens and other areas on the base that looked like they were suitably overgrown, I went back and took out some Mod Podge. Watering it down slightly, I spread it over the flatter areas and started to add static grass. Because I needed this to look like it was in the autumn, I spread mainly a yellowish color static grass, but I did mix in some greens here and there to add variety and put down the odd clump of just pure green. Because this diorama was supposed to take place in the autumn, I decided I should add some fallen leaves, and I went to an old standby for me, dried oregano. I spread some patches of Mod Podge here and there on the model where I thought fallen leaves might accumulate, and then I just went ahead and sprinkled the oregano on. I was now ready to start thinking about how the subjects would be laid out on the base, so I placed the vehicles on the diorama but didn't fix them down permanently, and then went and got out some infantry I had painted previously. This was a number of German officers and some ammunition bearers. Using a pair of tweezers, I glued each infantry model in place using superglue. To protect my work so far, I now went back over the whole model with a couple coats of matte varnish. This would protect everything and help seal down the static grass and the fallen leaves. When this was complete, I now needed to add the gloss effects. I got out some glossy Mod Podge and thickly layered it into the bottom of the ditch to imply standing water. I also went ahead and got out some gloss varnish and painted in some pools of standing water here and there, such as between some of the larger cracks on the road and on the patio stones. This was the final step of the model, and altogether building it took pretty close to a full month. It comprised 4 infantry figures, a German half-track, a German Puma reconnaissance vehicle, and a Russian T-34. And with that, this project and my entry for Lack of Foresight Gaming's Great YouTube Paint Off was complete.